At dawn, the town of Mercy Creek had already dug a grave, not for a dead man, but for one who was still riding in. The grave lay waiting on the hill above town, beneath a twisted cottonwood tree where the wind never stopped blowing. A wooden marker had been driven into the dirt before sunrise. The letters were carved rough, bitter, and absolute. No name, no birth date, no prayers, no mercy. Below that hill, the whole town was steeped in silence. Every window stared out at the eastern road. Every hand rested on a gun butt, and every mouth was clamped shut on the exact same secret. By noon, a man would ride into Mercy Creek. By dusk, they aimed to bury him. But the town had made a mistake. They thought silence meant fear, and they had never met a man whose silence was heavier than a cocked Colt. He rode in real slow, a tall, aging drifter on a black horse, cutting through the haze of dust like a shadow that had forgotten where it belonged. A wide-brimmed black hat obscured half his face. A frayed duster flapped in the wind. Around his neck was a faded red bandana, the color of dried blood washed by the rain too many times. At his hip sat an old Colt revolver. Not flashy, not for show, just waiting. A silver pocket watch hung from his vest chain, catching a thin ray of sunlight as his horse stepped past the... But he did. He always heard it. The nameless gunslinger stopped in the middle of the street. No one came out to greet him. No dogs barking. No children laughing. Only the bell on the coffin-maker's door chimed once in the wind, as if the town itself had just called him. Mercy Creek didn't always hate strangers. This place used to be a stopover for travelers to water their horses, miners to spend their silver, and widows to sell bread without having to nervously look over their shoulders. But 3 years ago, a sheriff named Silas Rudd took over the town. And men like Rudd don't protect towns. They collect them. He wore a badge polished enough to blind honest folks. He preached the Bible on Sundays and ordered beatings on Mondays. He pinned wanted posters to the church wall, then picked out whoever looked guilty enough to fit the charge. Mercy Creek called it the law. But the law, when in the hands of bad men, is just violence dressed in clean clothes. Mercy Creek's secret wasn't that Sheriff Rudd was corrupt. Everyone knew that. This secret was much worse. 3 weeks before the nameless gunslinger arrived, a young schoolteacher named Clara Whitcomb found a ledger hidden beneath the floorboards of the old jail. Names, bribes, fabricated sentences, confessions signed by illiterate men, and a final page torn nearly in half. On that page was a name no one dared to speak aloud. A name tied to a massacre years ago. A name from the nameless gunslinger's past. Clara Whitcomb was found dead the next morning by the dry creek bed north of town. Rudd called it a robbery. The town called it a tragedy. But the coffin maker, when washing the dirt from her hands, found ink beneath her fingernails. And that meant Clara didn't die while running away. She died while hiding the truth. The nameless gunslinger dismounted outside the saloon. The doors were wide open, but there was no lively piano music, no cards slapping against tables, no clinking of glass against wood. Inside, men sat with untouched drinks. The kind of silence that didn't belong to peace. The kind of silence waiting for permission to erupt into violence. Standing at the bar was Sheriff Silas Rudd, tall, clean-shaven, gray-eyed, wearing a white hat far too new for this filthy town. Beside him were 4 deputies, each the type of man who would laugh out loud at the sight of the weak trembling. Rudd looked at the stranger's revolver, then up at his face, then down at the silver pocket watch, and for the first time that morning, his smile vanished. "Just passing through?" Rudd spoke up. The nameless gunslinger didn't answer. Rudd stepped closer. This town doesn't take kindly to mutes. Still no answer. A deputy scoffed. Reckon his tongue's cut out. The gunslinger slowly pulled off a glove. Not to draw his gun, not to threaten, just to place 3 coins on the counter. For the water, he said. Low, dry, enough to make the room feel smaller. Rudd's hand slowly drifted toward the badge on his chest. You ever been to Mercy Creek before? The gunslinger looked at him for a long time. Then his eyes drifted toward a small framed photograph behind the bar. Clara Whitcomb, smiling beside 6 children in front of the schoolhouse. The gunslinger's expression didn't change, but the pocket watch ticked 1 beat beneath his duster. Rudd followed his gaze. And now, the trap had sprung. You knew her, Rudd said. The gunslinger said nothing. Rudd smiled again. Then maybe you're the one who killed her. A murmur rippled through the saloon. This accusation had been waiting all morning. This town didn't need justice. It needed a shape for its fear, and a quiet stranger was the easiest shape to hang. They didn't arrest him. Not yet. That was the cunning of Mercy Creek. A town afraid of the truth will often try to look fair before revealing its cruelty. Rudd gave the nameless gunslinger 1 hour to leave. 1 hour before the sheriff reconsidered his stance. The gunslinger stepped out into the street without a word of protest. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, flattening the shadows. Now, the grave on the hill was visible from town, its wooden marker leaning in the wind. No name, a warning, or a prophecy. He led his black horse to the water trough. The animal dipped its head, drinking slowly, while the gunslinger stood by and watched the town watching him. A curtain twitched in the hotel window. A boy hid behind a rain barrel. The blacksmith paused his hammer. Across the street, the coffin-maker cracked his door just enough to speak. You ought to ride out of here, the old man said. The gunslinger looked at him. The coffin-maker's name was Ephraim Cole, a frail old man with tired hands and eyes that had measured far too many caskets. They dug it before breakfast, Ephraim said. That grave ain't a threat. It's a vote. The gunslinger looked up at the hill, then back at the old man. Who voted? He asked. Ephraim swallowed hard. Everyone still breathing. For a moment, the gunslinger said nothing. Then he pulled the silver pocket watch from his vest and popped the lid. There was no portrait inside, just a small folded piece of paper, its edges worn from being touched over the years. He checked the time, then snapped it shut. Ephraim's eyes were glued to the watch. I've seen that piece before, the coffin-maker whispered. The gunslinger looked at him, and for the first time, something almost human flickered across his face. Not fear, but recognition, pain. But before Ephraim could say another word, a sharp rifle crack rang out from somewhere up the street. The water trough exploded right next to the horse. Water and wood splinters sprayed into the air. The black horse reared, and every man in Mercy Creek reached for their gun in unison. The nameless gunslinger didn't draw. That was what terrified them the most. A bullet had torn through the air, ripping the brim of his hat. Yet he still didn't draw. He just held tight to the black horse's reins, calming it with one hand, and looked up, not at the rooftops, but at the bell tower. A slight movement up there. A flash of light off glass. Someone had fired from inside the church. Rudd came stomping out into the street with his deputies right behind him, his revolver already drawn. Well, Rudd shouted. Seems trouble just follows you around. The gunslinger turned slowly. No, he replied. It was already waiting here. A crowd had gathered near the general store, pale faces, clenched jaws, fear spreading through them like a sickness. Then a body fell from the church bell tower. It hit the wooden steps below with a sickening thud that made even the deputies shudder. The dead boy was young, not past 17. He lay next to a rifle, a piece of red cloth tied around his wrist, the same red worn by Rudd's deputies. The sheriff stared down at the kid's body. He froze for a single heartbeat, and the gunslinger noticed. Rudd quickly regained his composure. Damn fool, he said. Must have been looking to make a name for himself. The gunslinger knelt beside the boy. He didn't touch the gun. He touched the boy's fingers. No black powder burns on them. No smell of fresh gunpowder. The rifle had been fired. But not by this kid. The gunslinger looked back up at the bell tower. A second shadow shifted behind the slats. Someone else had been up there. The one who threw the boy down to silence him forever. The gunslinger stood up. A deputy raised his gun. "That's enough out of you." The gunslinger looked at Sheriff Rudd. "Who is he?" Rudd's jaw tightened. "Nobody." The gunslinger's eyes turned sharp and cold. "In towns like this," he said, "nobody is usually someone very much worth killing." The crowd heard that. So did Rudd. And suddenly, Mercy Creek was no longer just staring at a stranger. They were watching a secret begin to take shape. 10/12/30. An investigation through silence and visual clues. Though he didn't ask many questions. Men like him knew well enough that questions could bleed through walls. So instead, he listened. The thud of boot heels on the boardwalk. The whispers behind the shutters. The nervous strike of a match against a deputy's thumb. He went to the church first. Inside, the air smelled of rotting wood, dust, and fear. Sunlight pierced through the broken slats of the bell tower, casting bright streaks like golden blades. Up in the belfry, he found 3 things: a rifle casing, a drop of blood on the railing, and a button torn from a coat cuff. Not the boy's. A brass button, embossed with a small star. Standard issue for deputies. The gunslinger placed it in his palm and closed his fingers. Then he found the scuff marks. Not from a ricochet, but from boot heels. Someone had slipped while lifting the body. A heavy man. A man with a limp. Back down on the street, one of Rudd's deputies favored his right leg. His name was Jonas Pike. Thick-shouldered, scarred cheek, always smirking with just one side of his mouth. The gunslinger saw him watching from the awning of the jailhouse. Pike saw the gunslinger looking back. His smirk vanished. The next clue was at the schoolhouse. Clara Whitcomb's room remained untouched. Children's chalk slates on little desks. Dog-eared world maps. A broken piece of chalk on the floor by the teacher's desk. The gunslinger walked in without removing his hat. Not out of disrespect, but out of habit. Men who lived too long with danger didn't like setting anything down. On the chalkboard, Clara had written a sentence before she died. Most of it had been frantically erased, but the chalk dust lingered in the grooves of the wood. The gunslinger leaned in close. One word remained. Raven. He stared at it. Then his hand moved toward the pocket watch. Tick. Tock. Raven wasn't the name of a bird. Not to him. It was a name buried under the dust of time for 12 years. And Mercy Creek had just dug it up. By mid-afternoon, the town had found its second victim. Ephraim Cole, the coffin-maker, was dragged out of his shop by 2 deputies and thrown into the street. In his cupboard, they had found a page from Clara's ledger. At least, that was what Sheriff Rudd declared. Blood trickled from the corner of the old man's mouth. His hands trembled. The crowd gathered again, craving certainty, because certainty is easier than courage. Rudd held up the torn paper. Ephraim Cole concealed evidence in a murder investigation, he announced. Maybe he's the one who killed Miss Whitcomb to keep her quiet. A woman screamed. Someone cursed. A stone was thrown. It struck Ephraim in the shoulder. The nameless gunslinger watched from the steps of the schoolhouse. Still silent, still waiting. Rudd turned to him. You seem interested in justice, stranger. Here it is. The gunslinger stepped down into the street, real slow. Every wooden plank groaned beneath his boots. He stopped beside Ephraim and looked at the paper in Rudd's hand. The torn edge was wrong. Too clean. Clara had ripped the last page in a panic. This page was cut with a knife. The gunslinger looked at Ephraim. You hide it? Ephraim wheezed. Yes. The crowd murmured. Rudd smiled. But the weathered coffin-maker looked up through the blood and dirt. I hid it 'cause she gave it to me, Ephraim said. Not 'cause I killed her. Rudd's smile vanished. Ephraim continued, his voice broken. She came to my shop the night before she died. Said the ledger held the names of the men who buried the truth before they could even bury the bodies. The gunslinger looked at Rudd. "What about the page?" Ephraim's eyes flicked toward the church. "She tore it in two, gave me half, said the other half would save a man who hadn't arrived yet." The crowd fell dead silent. The gunslinger's voice dropped low. "What man?" Ephraim looked at him. "You." The word struck the street harder than a gunshot. This town had wanted the nameless gunslinger dead before he even arrived. But Clara Whitcomb had been waiting for him, and that meant this wasn't a murder he had accidentally stumbled into. It was a message. Sheriff Rudd ordered Ephraim locked in the jail. The gunslinger didn't stop them, not because he agreed, but because he was watching to see who looked relieved. The banker looked relieved. The hotel owner looked relieved. Deputy Jonas Pike looked afraid. Fear tells more truth than confessions. As the deputies dragged Ephraim away, a small hand tugged on the gunslinger's duster. He knelt. A boy stood there, maybe 9 years old, hollow-cheeked, dust on his face, eyes far too serious for a child. "My sister said you'd come," the boy whispered. The gunslinger crouched down. "Which sister?" "Miss Clara. She wasn't my real sister, but she said that didn't matter." The boy held out a folded strip of cloth, faded red, the same color as the gunslinger's bandana. Inside was a key, small, iron, old. The gunslinger took it. The boy looked at his Colt revolver. "You gonna kill him?" The question hung in the air. Not innocent, not malicious, just honest, the way only children can be. The gunslinger looked toward the jail, then up toward the grave on the hill. "No," he answered. The boy frowned. "Then how do you make bad men stop?" The gunslinger lowered his eyes. For a long while, he had no answer, because once, a long time ago, he had believed exactly what the bad men believed, that the world could be fixed with a bullet, that justice was just revenge, wearing a cleaner coat. Then he stood up. "Sometimes," he said, "they stop when decent folks refuse to stay on their knees." The boy didn't understand that yet, not right now, but the whole town heard him, and that was what mattered, because the truth doesn't always come like thunder. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, so quiet the cowards have to lean in to hear it. The key unlocked a drawer beneath Clara Whitcomb's desk. Inside was the other half of the torn ledger page, and a letter addressed specifically to the man with the silver watch. The nameless gunslinger stood alone in the schoolhouse as the light cast orange hues across the floorboards. He opened the letter. Clara's handwriting was neat, but the final lines trembled. She knew she was being hunted. She knew Rudd would pin the blame on someone else. And she knew the nameless gunslinger would understand the name written in the ledger, the Raven Gang. 12 years ago, before he became a drifter, before he stopped using his name, before he learned that silence was safer than memories, he had ridden alongside men who called themselves the Raven Gang. Not soldiers, not outlaws, something much worse. Men hired by deep-pocketed tycoons to clear the frontier of any living soul in the way. Farmers who wouldn't sell their land. Witnesses who wouldn't lie. Towns standing in the path of railroads, mines, water, and gold. The nameless gunslinger wasn't their leader, but he had ridden with them. And with certain sins, it doesn't matter if you struck the match or just stood guard while the house burned down. The silver pocket watch had belonged to a man he couldn't save. A sheriff named Daniel Whitcomb, Clara's father. The night Daniel died, he pressed the watch into his hand and said only one thing: "Live long enough to tell the truth." The gunslinger had lived, but he had never spoken, never told the whole story, until he came to Mercy Creek, until Clara Whitcomb died, trying to finish what her father started. The gunslinger folded the letter and closed his eyes. Outside, the church bell tolled once, not for a prayer, for a gathering. Sheriff Rudd had summoned the town to witness an execution. Ephraim Cole would hang at sundown, and if the nameless gunslinger intervened, That grave on the hill would officially have an occupant. Dusk painted Mercy Creek red. Not a beautiful red, a warning red, the kind of color that made every face look guilty. They had erected a gallows right in front of the jail. Ephraim stood on it with a noose around his neck, his frail body shivering in the wind. Sheriff Rudd stood below, his deputies spread across the street, 3 on the boardwalk to the left, 2 by the livery stables. Jonas Pike, in front of the church, and Rudd dead center, his hand resting casually near his holster. It wasn't an execution. It was a firing squad. Every angle calculated, every window watched, every escape route sealed. And yet, the nameless gunslinger walked right in. His black horse waited behind at the edge of town, reins hanging loose, as if the animal understood there were paths a man had to walk alone. Rudd raised his voice. Mercy Creek has convicted Ephraim Cole of murder. No, the gunslinger spoke up. Just one word. But it cut through the town like a door blown wide open in a burning house. Rudd smiled. You got proof that says otherwise? The gunslinger reached inside his duster. 5 gun barrels leveled at him in unison. He moved real slow and pulled out the torn ledger page. Not a weapon. Something far more dangerous. The truth. He held it up. The ledger has your name, he said. It has Pike's name, the banker's name. It logs every false arrest you sold to the Raven Gang. The crowd stirred. The banker stepped back. Rudd burst out laughing, but there was no warmth in the sound. A scrap of paper from a dead woman? The gunslinger looked at him. Dead women usually leave cleaner testimonies than cowardly living men. Whispers flared up again. Rudd's eyes went cold. He gave a single nod. Pike stepped out from the church doors and aimed his gun at the gunslinger's back. But before he could squeeze the trigger, the boy from the schoolhouse yelled out, "Behind you!" The gunslinger pivoted, not as fast as a young buck, not flashy, just fast enough. Pike's bullet tore through the hem of his duster and embedded itself in the wooden post right next to Ephraim's head. The street erupted. But the gunslinger still hadn't fired first. He only drew after Pike had taken his shot. One shot. Pike's gun flew from his grip, tumbling into the dust. Pike dropped to his knees, still alive, screaming, his shooting hand shattered. The whole town saw it. The nameless gunslinger could have killed him, but he chose not to. And that choice shook Mercy Creek more than any bloodshed ever could. Right then, Rudd drew. A clean draw. A lawman's draw. Expert. The kind of skill that had ended countless arguments before they could turn into the truth. But the nameless gunslinger was already squared up against him. 2 men standing in the heart of Mercy Creek. One wearing a badge. One with no name. One who used the law to cloak his violence. One who had dealt in violence and spent years trying to crawl out of that mud. Rudd's voice dropped. You think they'll thank you? You think this town wants the truth? They just need someone to blame. Today it's you. Tomorrow it'll be someone else. The gunslinger said nothing. Rudd stepped closer. You and me, we're the same breed. The gunslinger's eyes raised. No, Rudd smiled. You rode with the Raven Gang. Gasps rippled through the crowd. There it was. The festering, hidden wound. The name that could bury him without firing a single bullet. The gunslinger didn't deny it. He looked out at the town, looked at the boy, looked at Ephraim, looked at Clara's empty schoolhouse. Then he unclipped the silver pocket watch and held it in his palm. I rode with them, he said, and I've been carrying the dead ever since. Nobody moved. Even Rudd seemed to hesitate now. The gunslinger went on. A guilty man can hide behind silence. I did just that, for years. He looked up at the grave on the hill. But silence doesn't wash a man clean. It only lets the dirt settle. Rudd cocked his gun. You should have kept your mouth shut. The gunslinger's hand hovered near his Colt. He only had one choice. Kill the sheriff. And the town would only remember this as just another shootout. Refuse to fire, and Rudd would murder him in the street. Then Ephraim Cole spoke from the gallows. Not loud, but crystal clear. Sheriff Rudd murdered Clara Whitcomb. The town turned in an uproar. Ephraim swallowed hard. I washed her hands. There was ink under her nails. And there was no robbery. She still had her necklace, still had her purse. Only the ledger was missing. The banker yelled, "Liar!" But then another voice spoke up. The hotel owner. "I saw Pike skulking around the schoolhouse that night." Then a woman near the general store. "Rudd arrested my husband on charges he never even got to hear." Then the blacksmith. "My brother had to sign a confession with a broken hand." One by one, Mercy Creek began to stand up, not with guns, with words. And Rudd realized too late that the nameless gunslinger hadn't come to win a shootout. He'd come to make the town find its voice. Rudd pulled the trigger. The gunslinger drew. 2 shots answered each other. Rudd's bullet grazed the gunslinger's ribs. The gunslinger's bullet smashed into Rudd's revolver, shattering the grip and knocking the weapon from his hand. Rudd fell backward into the dusty street, alive, disarmed, exposed. The badge on his chest caught the last dying light of the day. For the first time, it looked remarkably small. They cut the rope and helped Ephraim down. There was no cheering. Mercy Creek wasn't saved in a single evening. Towns don't become honest overnight, just because a corrupt man falls from grace. But something had shifted. A woman picked the ledger page off the ground. The blacksmith stripped Rudd of his badge. The banker tried to run, only to find 3 town boys blocking the alleyway. Jonas Pike sobbed on the church steps, not out of remorse, but because men like him only understand pain when it finally belongs to them. The nameless gunslinger stood alone near the water trough that had been blasted apart that morning. Water still trickled onto the street, forming dark mud in the dust. The boy approached him. "You leaving?" The gunslinger looked toward the hill. The grave still lay waiting. The marker still read no name. He walked toward it as night fell over Mercy Creek. The whole town followed quietly, keeping their distance. He stood before the empty grave. Then he yanked the marker out of the dirt. For a moment, everyone thought he would smash it. Instead, he flipped it over and used his knife to carve new words into the back. He drove it back into the head of the empty grave, and Mercy Creek finally found the courage to bow its head. Before dawn, the nameless gunslinger rode west. No reward, no farewell speeches, no name revealed, just a black horse striding under a pale morning sky, and a silver pocket watch ticking a rhythm close to a heart that had bled. Behind him, Mercy Creek began the hard work of becoming something better than its fear. But redemption isn't a door you just walk through once. It's a road, and every road in the West is paved with bones underneath. When the first ray of light touched the horizon, the gunslinger opened Clara's letter one last time. There was another line he hadn't seen in the dark. A final warning written just below her signature. The Raven Gang isn't dead. They're building a new town past the Salt Flats, and they know you still have the watch. The gunslinger folded the letter. His eyes remained locked on the West. For a long while, he said nothing. Because when he stayed silent for too long, it meant someone was about to have to tell the truth. And in the West, the truth is the only bullet no man can outrun. If this story finds you in some quiet place, ride with us into the next chapter of the nameless gunslinger. There are many towns ahead, many buried sins, and many men who believe a badge can cover up a grave. But some graves won't stay quiet forever.